Hello all, my name is Christina Vogel, and my paper is titled Wartime Allies, the Essentialness of the Hmong During the American Involvement in Vietnam. The Hmong were wartime allies of the United States during the war in Vietnam, whose contributions were greatly significant to American interests in Southeast Asia. The relationship between the Hmong and the United States requires examination, as it served as a model for other local alliances between the United States and minority groups within a nation during wartime. Like other wartime allies, the United States actively recruited the Hmong as allies due to their status as a minority group in Southeast Asia. The Hmong aided the United States on intelligence missions, conducted operations, and aided in the recovery of American missing in action during and after the Vietnam War. After the war, the Hmong were largely faced with abandonment from the United States, but some migrated to the United States on refugee status. The Hmong faced discrimination before the arrival of colonial powers and the influence of the United States. Originally from Southeast China, the Hmong moved into Southeast Asia 400 years ago due to the migration of the Han Chinese into their native territory. The Hmong were in opposition already to the established kingdoms of Southeast Asia, modern-day Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. During the time of French colonization, the Hmong were also opposed to new powers moving into Southeast Asia. When communism arrived into Southeast Asia, faced again with marginalization, the Hmong chose to side with the United States to combat the newly established communist regimes. The Hmong would become the first minority group allies for the United States before, during, and after the Vietnam War. Studying the Hmong is important, as they served as a model to other minority group allies for the United States. In other post-Vietnam conflicts, the United States worked with local minorities such as the Contras in the 1980s, the Kurds in Iraq in the 1990s and the 2000s, and various tribes in Afghanistan as wartime allies. Like the Hmong before them, they were actively recruited by the United States and performed a diverse range of tasks in alliance with the United States, and faced similar abandonment once the United States withdrew. While all of these scenarios are isolated scenarios on their own, examining the similarity of the actions of the United States in all of these conflicts is important to ensure better and more equitable treatment of wartime allies by the United States. The Hmong, being the original case for the minority group ally, needs to be studied in order to benefit future wartime allies of the United States. Also important in studying the contribution of the Hmong before, during, and after the active involvement of the United States in Vietnam is the acknowledgement of the great contribution of the Hmong as wartime allies to the United States. Only in recent decades did the Hmong receive any formal recognition for their great contribution as allies in Southeast Asia. Recognition of the overlooked contributions of the Hmong is also important in studying the Hmong in the timeline of their efforts as wartime allies in Vietnam. This paper will provide a more Hmong-focused analysis of the relationship between the Hmong and the United States during the years the United States was actively involved in Southeast Asia from the United States, and finally the withdrawal from the United States of Southeast Asia and the immigration of some of the Hmong to the United States. Studying this paper will be operations such as Operation Sparrow Roll and the role of the Hmong in Special Forces operations. The research highlights the recurring themes in the relationship between the Hmong and the United States, especially the mutual need for support and the Hmong experience. Themes in previous literature include recruitment, the alliance, and the abandonment of the Hmong. In the research, it is addressed that the Hmong were responsible for ground operations and intelligence missions, and the role of the Hmong is noted along with their contributions. But these sources never fully give credit to the Hmong as wartime allies. Scholarship also notes the abandonment of the Hmong by the United States and the diaspora and the migration of the Hmong to other countries. Still, much of the literature on the Vietnam War only briefly mentions the Hmong and the role of allies in Southeast Asia during the American intervention of the region. Instead, most of the literature focuses on the American perspective and experience, of the conflict in Southeast Asia. This paper will use available American sources to construct an account focused on the Hmong and how the United States' involvement affected them. The American alliance began in 1959 when the Hmong were recruited by the United States in northern Laos. Already, the Hmong had their status as a marginalized group and were not accepted by the majority population. Opposition to the mainstream communist culture made it easy for the Hmong to favor the United States with its goal of containing communist ideology in Southeast Asia. American forces led by Bill Lair, a Central Intelligence operative, recruited ethnic minorities to construct and fight communist forces in Vietnam and Laos. The CIA and Special Forces were responsible for training the Hmong in these missions. In the early years of the war, the goal of the United States was to ensure that there was as little involvement done as possible with the American forces in Southeast Asia. The program training the Hmong to fight communism in Laos and Vietnam was continued to increase in size by the Kennedy administration, with American Special Forces training Hmong forces. The Hmong largely served in the Royal Lao Army. In a 2002 interview, Colonel Brodus Bailey recalled how the Hmong and the relationship of the Hmong with the United States led up to the Vietnam War. Colonel Bailey was a field artillery operator in Vietnam and worked with CIA detachments and the Hmong forces in Vietnam in 1964 and 1969. According to Bailey, the Hmong were not disciplined and not adequately trained and were not adequately paid and were surrounded by their families. Bailey observed that American forces were favored over Hmong forces. Bailey also describes the relationship between the Army and CIA and how there was an internal strife, which at times disadvantaged the Hmong, and the need for effectiveness before and during the fighting of the war. Austin Long, a senior policy analyst at the Rand Corporation, offered a similar account of the Hmong during Special Forces operations in Vietnam. Like Bailey, he noted how that they were not as battle-ready in comparison to the United States forces. Long described the recruitment of the Hmong and why the Hmong were willing to work with the United States. Excluded already from participations in their government within the nations of Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Laos, they chose to agree with the propositions of the United States, and viewed the United States' support as a principal alternative to continuing neglect. The United States intervention offered the Hmong a chance at participation in their governments and protection from governments who openly opposed their existence. Austin Long also describes how the Hmong were disadvantaged from the beginning of American intervention. Long notes how their small number and inability to create full-size elements. The Hmong had significantly less resources to fight on the behalf of the United States, as required for a full-size fighting force. Motivated to protect their families, these irregulars, even with more training and resources allowed, would never be able to be a regular infantry capable of frontal assault. Despite receiving training from American forces, the Hmong would never be a self-sustainable fighting force. The United States also remained cautious in aiding the Hmong as they wanted as little knowledge of operations known to the American public. A primary incentive for the Hmong was aid promised by the United States. For example, during the time of initial recruitment, the United States promised Lieutenant Colonel Vang Pao, a key leader in the Royal Lao Army and ethnic Hmong, military and humanitarian support for the Hmong, as well as protection from the communists. Because of this, the United States listed military operations with the Hmong under the United States Agency for International Development. Aid to the Hmong included a headquarters and hospital near Langchang, where the CIA and Royal Lao forces set up military operations. Officially, in all American policymakers and government documents, operations of the Hmong were listed as humanitarian operations. However, the fact that early operations of the Hmong were conducted through Special Forces operations caused problems, as the United States Special Forces, by American policy, could not aid CIA-sponsored Provisional Reconnaissance Unit operations, causing difficulties ensuring American objectives were met in Southeast Asia. The United States was largely hands-off to its approach to the conflict in Southeast Asia, and the Hmong created a greater threat and enemy to the communist governments of Vietnam and Laos. Having greater status as a threat due to their status as American allies, the Hmong were further targeted by communist forces. During the United States occupation of Vietnam, The United States largely used the Hmong for recovery missions. The Hmong would aid the United States in areas the United States could not reach with their forces in Vietnam. Bailey describes the sentinelist missions carried out by the Hmong. The burden of the combat was carried out by the Hmong, under the tutelage of the CIA and Thai regulars. They were the ones we counted if something had to be done. During the strategic bombing of Operation Barrel Roll in northern Vietnam and Laos, the Hmong did ground missions for the United States in areas the United States would not send its own forces. Also during the war, the Hmong largely aided the Americans, missing in action and POWs to safety, and the United States could not operate. An example of the Hmong contributions before and during the war is Operation Barrel Roll. Operation Barrel Roll was a concentrated bombing of Laos, northern Thailand, and Vietnam during the 1960s. In 1962, the pro-American government in Laos requested the aid of the United States in equipment and military intervention against the communist forces in their country. The United States' goal in Laos, like it had been in other countries in Southeast Asia, was to contain the spread of communism from the influence of the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. However, the American public was not made aware of the American operations in Laos, especially Operation Barrel Roll. The operations were conducted by day and night operations with bombing-focused areas with potential threats and communist strongholds. The Hmong forces were largely responsible for the ground operations required for the success of Operation Barrel Roll. William Head, who does emphasize the role of the Hmong as allies to the United States, explains that they were often conducted operations where the United States may have not been permitted to send their ground troops, or was geography or publicly isolated. However, Head notes the lack of clarity for the success of the Hmong forces in the United States. The outcome was no more successful nor less destructive. Like the other United States operations in Laos, the outcome of the success of the operations was not measurable by any true standard, and was largely provided destructive over successful. The strategic bombing of Operation Barrel Roll lasted until the summer of 1973. Head also looks at the efforts of the Hmong forces and the American Air Force to disrupt the northern Vietnamese army supply chains along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Head explains that Hmong forces had 150 volunteers who lived in the jungles maintained by the trail. By 1964, the Allies began an air support campaign against the mobile and stationary targets along the route in southwestern North Vietnam, through southeastern Laos, and into South Vietnam. During the war, the Hmong continued to work on behalf of the United States. However, the Hmong were largely worn out as a guerrilla fighting force by the time of the arrival of the large-scale American forces in 1964. Many of the United States experts at the time agreed that the Hmong had not reached the level of competence of a professional fighting force due to the United States' ability to properly aid them. The United States continued the secret war of the CIA, only with less support provided for the Hmong, as the war effort in Vietnam, with more direct involvement from the United States, increased. The strategic bombing operations of the Hmong led to a heavy reliance on the Hmong and the United States force operations. With the withdrawal of the American forces in 1973, the Hmong were largely incapable of sustaining themselves as a fighting force. The Hmong faced a series of defeats in the post-U.S. involvement years. The Northern Vietnamese Army was more effective as a fighting force and responsible for a series of ambushes on Hmong forces. The Hmong, having made themselves an enemy to the communist forces due to its entanglements with the United States, continued to fight these communist forces. The Hmong continued to fight for their preservation. The Hmong were made enemies by the nations in Southeast Asia they resided for centuries. The Hmong had become post-war targets of communist forces. The Hmong's numbers dwindled as they were subjugated to a series of attacks. The Hmong no longer had support from the United States as wartime allies. Along with the support and protection of the United States, any aid promised to benefit the Hmong was non-existent. The protection promised to them in the early years of the war was non-existent after 1975. The Hmong no longer were the large ethnic population they were at the beginning of their fight against the Communists at the end of the 50s. In conclusion, the Hmong were initially a minority indigenous wartime ally to follow the trend of recruitment, strategic alliance, and abandonment by the United States. The Hmong in the past historical context were largely overlooked for their contribution to the United States. The Hmong follow the timeline with the relationship to the United States: recruitment, wartime alliance, and abandonment. The United States recruited the Hmong, promising aid and protection from the Hmong. The Hmong were recruited as a minority group who already opposed communist forces in Southeast Asia. The Hmong were essential as a guerrilla force and aided the United States in intelligence gathering. Largely, the Hmong continued pro-American operations after the withdrawal of American forces in Vietnam. The Hmong faced hardships without the protection of the United States. By studying the Hmong, an understanding of the minority group alliances the United States made and currently makes in times of conflict can be more deeply analyzed.